Hi, everybody. This is Eddie White again at the English Language Testing Society, and this is our second assessment literacy webinar. So thanks for joining. We've got people from lots of different places, from around the US and Brazil and Honduras and Saudi Arabia and lots of different places. So thanks for coming and joining us. So basically, what I end up doing is that I have I have a slideshow and I just present some information, and then we kind of open up a little bit and have some Q&A about what the topic is. And so the topic for today is about testing and assessing speaking. So I'm going to get into screen share mode and get going with my just my information, just a little bit of information about that. So we're talking about testing speaking, and so one of the things I want to just remind you about at the beginning. So I mean, the webinars are all about promoting assessment literacy, and that's something I've been doing. Been working with colleague Tani, and we've been doing this for a while now about promoting assessment literacy, and just reminding, just so we're talking about, you know, just about basic principles of sound assessments. What else is under assessment literacy here? So we have the development and use of assessment methodologies and techniques. Hi, I can hear some. Hi, I can hear some Arabic. Please, can you mute your? Who's on? Who needs to be on mute here? Okay, thank you for joining. And the last part is about just familiarity with standards of quality assessment. Okay, so a little reminder about what assessment literacy is. And if you joined us last week, just a reminder also about some of these key principles about language assessment. And they come up almost every time we're talking about testing, whether it's at the classroom level or at for mainstream assessment. So the principles can be, these principles can be applied to all kinds of assessment. So these are coming from this Brown and Abewick-Rama here, the book, and we can use them to design a test and also to evaluate a test. And here they are here. So if you joined us last week, just a reminder about those. And if you're new, I'm reminding you about them: practicality, reliability, validity, etc. Okay. Washback and authenticity. And just a reminder, so all of them can be expressed as a question. I'll quickly run through them again. So validity, does the test measure what we want to measure? Is all the work being consistently marked to the same standard? Is the procedure relatively easy to administer? Washback, does the assessment have positive effects on the learning and teaching that happen prior to the testing? And the washback, as you know, I'm sure can be positive or negative. And the last one is authenticity. And so we're talking about whether students or test takers are asked to perform real world tasks. And the example I gave last time, and I just repeat it again, sometimes some of the newer tests I've seen, for example, you're asked to identify whether in a vocabulary section, is this a word or not? So you're given a bunch of words and you're asked to identify which ones are words and which ones are not. And you know, that's the kind of task. When would you have that kind of a task in real world or in real life? And I can't think of an example. So it's not, I don't think it's a very authentic task to have in a test. Okay, next. So just a reminder, hi Perry, welcome. Perry, I think we're getting some feedback after you joined us. So I'm gonna put you on mute. I just put you on mute here, Perry. I think you're fine.
Okay.
Okay. So I have a picture of gold here. I'm gonna put somebody. I'm gonna put somebody on the spot. Holly, you're with us, right? Where's Holly? Holly, hi, Holly.
Hello, yes. Is that for me, that gold?
No, the gold is not for you, but I'm putting
really excited there for a minute.
I'm putting you on the spot now. So what is the next slide going to show? Why is Eddie showing us gold here?
Gold.
What's
the
connection?
Remember this trick. I think you've done this before, Eddie, and I don't remember.
Okay. I apologize, Holly, for putting you on the spot.
I don't mind.
So but talking about the 5 principles, the gold standard, of course, is, I mean, I'm reminding you about validity, right? I mean, validity is the gold standard assessment-wise, testing-wide, right? And if it's valid, it has to measure what it claims to measure. So if a test isn't valid, it can be practical, reliable, etc. But if it's not valid, then it's not, you know, it's got major problems. Okay, so we're getting into, after my brief review of things, we're getting into testing speaking, right? And so speaking English, and you've probably read and maybe memorized this article by now, this assessing speaking that I sent to you. And I mean, when we do the seminars, I like to have just a point of reference that we can go back to. And O'Sullivan presents some good ideas for us to talk about and consider here. He, just a reminder about some of the research, and he presents some of the research at the beginning of his article. So a few things to remind you about just the research into assessing speaking, right? And so he's saying that the speakers, I mean, their ability should be the primary thing impacting their performance, but other things affect students' performance too, and how they're being graded and scored, and things like age, gender, etc. So you have a bunch of different characteristics that affect their performance on tests, as well as their, you know, their ability. The interlocutor effect. So, for example, for interviews, who's doing the interview, and the person doing an interview can really have a major effect on the scores that a person is getting for their proficiency. For example, and you could have two different interviewers giving different scores, when of course the test taker, their language ability hasn't changed. So, you know, sometimes who's doing the interviewing will impact scores. O'Sullivan says that for task manipulation, if students are given more planning time, basically if students are given more planning time to prepare, usually they do better on assessments. A couple of more, I mean, the rating scale needs to be explicitly linked to what it is that we're testing. And he has the last one is about rater performance. Yeah, so I mean, hopefully whoever's scoring either a student or a test taker's performance, ideally, I mean, it's about their performance only, but there might be some effective reactions too from the rater. Maybe, I don't know, they don't like the student, or they don't like their hairstyle, or other things can come into play also. So you have a bunch of different things that can affect the testing and also the scoring. Everybody, just a reminder, and I mentioned this morning, and I want to say it now before I forget it. Generally, when you're thinking about assessing and testing, particularly speaking and writing, two things to focus on is just the task and then the scoring. So number one is the task. What is it we're asking students to perform, right? What tasks do we get them to do? And then the second one is how is it scored and how is it evaluated? So it's just a reminder to keep a focus on those two things. O'Sullivan presents a diagram, and it shows the different elements of a speaking test and how they fit into a testing system. And here it is here. And I think it's really good for a number of different reasons. And one of them is that it just reminds you of, I mean, people say that assessing speaking is one of the most challenging and difficult things, and primarily because there's so many elements and factors involved, and you get to see them here, whether it's the test task itself, or the characteristics of the test taker, how it's being scored. All of those factors come into play, which can make assessing speaking very challenging indeed. Okay, a quiz for you, or a question. 5 task types, the most commonly used types of tasks that are used to assess speaking. Okay, anybody want to take a shot at these, or take a guess at some of them? What are the most commonly used ways of testing speaking?
Interviews.
Interviews, yep, absolutely. Interviews is one of the primary ways.
Role
what else?
Play.
Sorry?
Role play.
Role plays, yeah. Role plays definitely a one also.
Debates.
Debates can also come into play, yep.
Group discussions.
Group discussions, yeah. You're getting most of or all of them here, okay? So let me just mention some of the ones that...
Presentations.
Presentations also. what is, before we get into the other ones, for presentations, what is it that makes presentations unique and distinct from other types of speaking tasks? Anybody?
Interaction.
Interaction, what do you mean interaction?
When they present something, so they can ask questions or they receive questions through their presentation. So this way
Yes,
they are
but
interacting with their audience.
you've just said the key word right there, audience,
Yeah.
right? If it's a presentation, usually there's an audience that's required, right?
Sure.
And you're speaking to an audience of people, and I think so to some degree that makes presentations kind of a bit unique and different from other types of speaking tasks. Okay.
Yeah. So they're not programmed.
Yeah. So the common ones that he mentions in the article are one-to-one interviews, student monologues, where students are now, it could be a type of presentation, or for example on the IELTS test, where students are asked to, you give them a topic and you give them a minute to prepare, and then they're asked to speak about it for a minute. Okay. And then you have small group interactions or small group discussions, and recorded stimuli. So this is how O'Sullivan puts in the article, but basically this is where students or test takers, you're given a prompt, like for example on the TOEFL test, and students are given a prompt, for example, what was your favorite class in high school? And they have to speak about it for a minute, right? So you have those recorded types of tests also. And the last one he mentions is about peer assessments and self-assessments that could be used in the class. And often these are for formative assessment. But the two most common ways of assessing speaking, particularly I mean in the classroom setting, are it's interviewing students or small group discussions. Those are very common one also. So just to ask everybody some questions now, what are the main types of speaking tests that you are using in your context? Anybody? Gabrielle, how about if for your context there in Brazil, what kind of speaking tests do you have? What kind of tasks?
A lot of monologues, role plays, mostly monologues, role plays, and presentations. Basically.
Right.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I'm thinking.
But
in my context, I usually depend on one-to-one interview at the beginning of the class, and then I move to individual presentations, and then co-presentations, and then I ask them to have a final project, so they have a team project at the end.
Wow, that's an extensive type of assessing speaking,
Yeah,
and
especially when it's a conversation class.
yeah, and I mean one of the good things about, I guess, any types of testing, one of the ideas is that you have some variety in how you're testing people, and that sounds like a good example. You're using a variety of different tasks there. Gabrielle, in your context, you're mentioning a couple of different ways, and is there anything that these ways have in common? And I'm thinking about something potentially problematic, and I'm wondering if it's a problem for you when you're assessing speaking. And you're mentioning about role plays, monologues, and something else.
I mentioned presentations.
Yeah.
What we were, the problems that we're facing, I'm looking here into the small group interaction. We have a few of those too.
Right.
And I think I mentioned in the last meeting that we had that that was one of our problems when we moved from the face-to-face classes into the virtual classes.
Yeah.
Because we're having some trouble doing the small groups in the platform that we are using.
Yep.
So I think we're losing a lot of that. So we're missing a lot of the student-student contact.
Yeah.
Interaction. And there's a lot of teacher-student, and so the interaction patterns are very limited.
I see. That's a good point. Here's a question for you, and just a question for everybody, is that one of the problems with speaking tasks sometimes is you get prepared speech, right? You get scripted speech, and students, they have stuff ready to say before the test starts. And sometimes even, I guess, with role plays, and I must admit, I guess I'm kind of biased against role plays, and it's probably why I haven't I haven't used them much at all, because often you get into prepared speech. And one of the challenges for all of us is, when you're assessing speaking, what you should be assessing is spontaneous language production, just like we're doing now in this kind of discussion, right? Anything that's scripted or prepared is I think it's problematic. And presentations are different. I mean, presentations is, you're expecting some level of preparation there, and that's fine. But for other tests of speaking, if it's something it's planned and prepared, especially if it's memorized, and students are just saying what they've memorized, then, and if you're giving them a score, that's not really an assessment of their spontaneous language production, and that's a potential problem, I think, that we have with those. Tani, please.
Patty? Yeah. So I was thinking, as you were talking about this, I think you can have spontaneous language production with the role play, as long as you don't give them the roles beforehand,
Yeah.
right? And you have them prepared. But I think that my biggest challenge with role plays is the effect of the interlocutor in the production of the other person. So if I'm paired with somebody who is not very fluent, or who's not giving me anything to work with, then my grade is going to be possibly lowered, because I haven't produced as much as I could, because you didn't get that back and forth. So I think that is my biggest challenge with role plays, is trying to match the level of ability. But then if you try to match the level of ability, then if you get too lower proficiency student, like they're not very proficient, then you don't really get a role play. And so this is, I think it's the biggest challenge for me with role plays.
And of course, one person's ability and performance can affect the other. So yeah. What about, please, anybody else, please jump in. What kind of tasks are you using for? What kind of tasks are you using for your assessing speaking?
I think we need to mute Perry again.
Mute Perry. Where's Perry?
Mute Perry.
There's Perry. Okay. Yeah.
He stepped away and the phone rang.
Yeah.
I'm doing a lot of group discussions.
Yeah.
And I guess I'm getting okay interactions. It's a very small class. I only have 7 students, and they're grad prep level. But I'm still finding that, my higher level and lower level, getting the same interaction from the lower level students, getting them to participate more, and having enough production to give them a grade. That's what I'm struggling with.
Yeah.
So that's the danger. Obviously, when you have, I have groups of maybe 3 or 4 students. I break them up, but it's still a problem.
And so sorry, Holly. So the problem is generating enough of a sample of language to assess. They're not producing much. Is that the problem?
Yeah, and it's an interesting task. We have a theme, and they have to bring in a video or an article that they've read or watched and briefly summarize it. And so that's a different kind of speech production I'm analyzing.
Yeah.
But then they have to either pose a question or take questions, and there is supposed to be a free-flowing discussion, practicing for the graduate classroom. And I find that it's always a couple students dominating that discussion and trying to get production from the perhaps quieter, more introverted students or lower level students is a problem.
Yeah.
So.
Anybody else, particularly with Holly, so about group discussions and how if that's been working for you or not?
In my classes, usually we have a problem with anxiety. So once it comes to open discussions, people feel that they're kind of worried about their levels. So they are kind of, taken aback, and they are not ready to interact. And actually I found out, okay, go ahead.
Sorry, but they're worried about their levels. Do you have different levels of ability in the same class?
It's not different levels, but usually you're going to find that the class, although that they had this kind of placement test at the beginning and they were categorized that they have the same level, but you're going to find that they have different potentials and different skills.
Yeah.
So they're not being assured when they come to the class. And once they have a task like this and we have an open discussion or they have to be involved or engaged, even in a short dialogue at the beginning. So I feel that they are not ready to interact. So it takes me some time first to break the ice, just to have this kind of safe and positive learning environment for them, just to help them actually interact and be open. I don't mind actually that they make mistakes. So they have to accept themselves. They have to accept that they are not high achievers, but they have to start working on this. So maybe the online classes actually help me with this, because now we have the breakout rooms. So I can take them in these rooms first, just to have this kind of chit chat to break the ice with them. And then they start mingling with other learners in the class.
Sherry, you make an important point. It's just about, you know, the any anxieties, as you know, test anxiety or anything that students are feeling that, of course, might affect their importance.
I had a very recent experience with TOEFL IBT test takers. They were a group of students, and they had actually this kind of preparation like 2 times before our class, and they still have the same problem. They had this training before face-to-face, but our class was online class.
I see.
So I started to use the online tools in order to help them actually get rid of their anxieties and start to analyze their problems and find solutions together. So it was very, very helpful.
Yeah.
And it was very helpful for them more than the face-to-face experience.
I see. That's interesting. Okay, good. Anybody else? You know, what types of testing are you using for assessing speaking?
For me, when I use Rouge here, Rouge.
Sorry, what is that again, Rouge?
Yeah, I was telling, when I use group discussion, then it's difficult for me to assess, because students start using their first language sometimes, and and it's difficult to control sometimes. I tell them not to use their first language, but still sometimes they cannot produce enough language, so they try to use Arabic, for example. So
I see.
I prefer interviews when assessing students. And also when they are nervous while talking, I can break the ice, I can talk to them, encourage them, and then they talk more freely than in group discussions.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, they both have different advantages. I've used, I mean, I haven't used role plays very much at all, but I had lots of positive experiences with group discussions at the English Center here at the University of Arizona. But particularly, I was teaching in Japan and teaching, you know, fairly large groups of students, and just the final exam was always groups of students, 3 or 4 students together. I would give them questions that, I mean, the questions are put on some cards on the table. One student was the group leader, and she was responsible for making sure everybody participated, and she was the one that asked the questions. And I'm sitting off to the side with my rubric, and you know, I was able to score people's performance, and it worked pretty well. Of course, the students are asking me, you know, Eddie, you know, can you give us some hints about what the questions are going to be? So, and I would just tell them, I said, so if we're going out for a coffee, we're going out for a coffee together. Before we sit down, should we plan and discuss what our questions are going to be before we start talking? And they said, well, no, that's ridiculous. And I said, well, I'm not telling you the questions. So, but I found that it worked pretty well once I set it up. And during classes, of course, we would have the class. The washback was, they would always have those types of discussions together. So class discussions was a regular part of class. And by the time final exam came around, they're doing something very similar. And it just, practicality wise, because the number of students, it's just, I could do it in 10 minutes, and I could do a whole bunch of students, and they were pretty comfortable with it as well. So
interesting.
yeah. So just
But do you think it also depends on the level of the students? So for beginners, it may not work properly.
No, I mean, I think even for beginners, you can, you can give them just simple questions where they're talking about the hobby or whatever. You can still do that with beginner levels, and of course more advanced levels, you can just give them more challenging and complicated things to talk about. Okay, everybody, let me just go back into screen share mode here again and show you a few more things that show you a few more things that I wanted to mention about testing speaking. So he gives 5 different types of tasks, and O'Sullivan talks about scoring. So again, just going back, you usually have those 2 things. What are the tasks we're asking students to be engaged in, and then how do we score them? And then he brings up some good questions about scoring. Okay, so how do we score the test performance? What type of scale are we going to use? How will we decide on the score? Particularly, what constitutes a passing score, right? Who's going to do the rating, and are you going to be needing any training involved? Okay, typically as classroom teachers, I mean, we often, I mean, we're the only people involved in testing speaking, so we don't need to do much rater training, but otherwise you do. With large scale testing, you do. If you're doing placement testing, you need some kind of training. And just where and when will the scoring be done? Okay, looks like another woman with a question. It's not really a quiz, but let me throw this out to you. So what are the 2 main types of scoring rubrics? How are they different? And which one is better to use?
One of them is holistic, I think.
Good, keep going.
I can't remember the other one right now.
Okay, somebody help out Gabby. So what, you have a holistic rubric?
Analytic.
The analytic one.
Yeah, so you have a holistic rubric and analytic rubric. How are they different?
One is kind of general and the other is specific.
Yep. Gabrielle, what you were going to say something?
Works in bands, or the holistic works in bands.
Yeah, I mean, with a holistic rubric, you're looking at the whole performance, and typically you're just giving one score, right? Analytic rubrics, you're giving multiple scores and combining them together. Which is better to use?
I guess it depends.
That's the answer we're looking for. It does. It depends. And
thank you.
I like that phrase, fit for purpose, and it's good in lots of different areas. But I mean, the rubric has to be fit for purpose, right? If it's a final exam, speaking exam, and it's got 30 students, then maybe a holistic rubric works better because you have so many people there. But sometimes an analytic one is better. So it just depends on the it depends on what's happening with the test and the type of test. Here's an example of a holistic rating scale here, and that's the one that was included in the article, and you got 1 to 9. It almost seems like IELTS has this kind of scoring system, I think 1 to 9. So you got all the way from expert speaker to very good. So you're giving people scores here. And then we have an example of an analytic rubric. And this is, what's this? This is used by the Foreign Services Institute. And so you see that you have these 5 different categories: accent, grammar, vocabulary, fluency, comprehension. Give them a score for each one, and then you add them together. I was just thinking of, I remember doing interviews for, I was doing interviews for students, and I had like 20. It was I was interviewing doing a final exam for another class, but I had like 25 or 30 students, and I had an analytic rubric like this. It was a nightmare. I didn't have enough time to add up all the scores, and then the next student is coming in, and yeah, I think I improvised some kind of scoring system for myself, So here's a question for you. Take a look at these different categories. Again, this is from the Foreign Services Institute. I think O'Sullivan mentions that this rubric is copied and used a lot. People use it for, to devise their own rubrics. Any issues or problems with these different categories for assessing speaking? I'm noticing something, and I don't know if it's a problem. I'll ask you.
Well, I certainly wouldn't call it accent. that's some judgment there that I wouldn't put on my
Aha.
students.
Okay.
It's about communication, not the quality of your accent.
But Holly, what about? I mean, I guess they're getting at pronunciation. And
Yeah,
if,
this should be a pronunciation category, not an accent category. If that's what they, I mean, the writing's kind of tiny. I can't read down to the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Maybe it is pronunciation, but they've relabeled it incorrectly.
Yeah, Perry's got a point, but before I forget, yeah, but just if you look at, I'm just noticing here, if you see under accent number 6, native pronunciation with no trace of foreign accent, and it's almost like a foreign accent is a bad negative thing, and it's like, yeah, that's kind of judgmental, definitely. Perry, please. Perry, you're on mute here. Can we unmute Perry?
Eddie, you muted me for a good reason, probably.
Yeah, sorry, Perry, go ahead.
That's all right. Yeah, I notice intonation is not listed. And the other thing, I understand the importance of all these things, but why would you just not have comprehension? Well, I mean, the purpose of speaking, judging a person's speaking ability is, do you understand what the hell they're saying?
Right, but comprehension is the final category here.
Yes, I see it, but I'm just wondering why it would not be the only category. You
mean that comprehension? Oh, just that is just have one category? That's just comprehension?
I'm just suggesting that, yeah, because what is the purpose of communication? It's comprehension.
Yeah.
So what more can you ask?
That's true, and you make a good point about if what we're talking about here is exchanging meaning, and it's all about exchanging meaning, then it makes sense. Yep. Anybody else? Any issues or things that you might notice about this rubric that you might find problematic? Honey, go ahead.
I'm just looking at this, and I'm thinking here. How do you really know that the person understands? Maybe it's a problem that they can't really speak, they cannot produce, but they understood what you said.
Yeah, so this is what I'm noted. This is what when I saw it, I said this comprehension category. Everything else is about language. Everything else is about language production, right? They're producing language, and we're making some judgments about how fluent they are, the vocabulary study. But you're right. I mean, comprehension is how well do they understand? I mean, how do you know? How do you know how well somebody is understanding something? So, for example, if Gabriel is giving me a test in my ability to speak Portuguese, and he's asking me some questions, and I understand what the questions are. Now, my speaking ability is not good enough to be able to respond in any good way, but meanwhile, I kind of understand what he's asking, right? And so, and Gabriel is like, Eddie doesn't understand anything, so I'm giving him a low score for this, but I kind of understand. But I think it's a little bit unusual to have a comprehension category in there. Understanding and taking into account Perry's earlier point about exchanging meaning, but this is about receiving language rather than producing it. Perry.
And wouldn't we have different way to assess that? Like we could assess their answers to questions, and did they get the right answer? We could do some sort of comprehension questions, but it wouldn't necessarily be this.
Yeah, you're right. Perry, you want to add something?
Yeah, the only thing, when I said comprehension, I was thinking of the person doing the testing comprehends the speaker. You're not testing listening skills here. You're only testing speaking skills. And
yeah.
When they're speaking, do you comprehend? Maybe I misunderstood what comprehend was for here, but do you understand what they're saying?
Yep.
As long as you understand what they're saying, is their English not good enough?
Yeah, and the issue with comprehension also, I mean, comprehension is very much depends on the interviewer or the interlocutor, right? It's not on the test taker and what is produced, and often. Now, of course, if the person doesn't understand any of your questions or anything that you're saying, then of course that's a problem. Yeah.
Well, I have a point to add here.
Please.
Especially when it comes to grammar. Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, as an examiner, and sometimes actually we have to overlook many grammatical mistakes as long as the test taker knows how to convey the ideas and communicate them properly.
can I ask you about that? So it's overlooking the grammar mistakes. That's what's a potential problem with that?
Well, I know that when it comes to grammar, many people actually get so anxious, and they care a lot about correcting themselves. So once they just, in the IBT, for example, they have just seconds to respond to something. So if they care a lot about the grammatical mistakes, they're just going to waste their time, and they're going to be so anxious, and they will never actually manage to talk about the given topic.
Right.
In the OET, this is the occupational test, they are asked to act. So if they care a lot about the grammar, they will never actually have this ability to act in the situation.
Sherry, which test is this? Sherry, by the way, where
are
you?
I'm in Egypt.
Okay. And so what is the test?
It's occupational test.
Uh-huh.
Occupational English test.
Okay.
This is mainly for the medical staff. So they have to, as a speaking interlocutor, I have to ask them to, I pretend that I'm a patient, and they act like doctors. So they start describing the situation, the case itself, and then they give me some solutions. So I test their ability to act. So if I just stressed every grammatical mistake or structure while they are working with me, this means that they're going to fail the test.
Yeah.
Because they're going to be so anxious.
Sherry, it sounds like it's a particular test. It sounds like almost English for
it's kind of different,
for special purposes. Yeah, you're testing other things rather than their just their proficiency. So
if we're just going to add something to the rubric here, we're just going to add this acting part.
Right. Okay. Gabrielle, you have a point?
Yeah, I have another point about grammar. We were reviewing we have our own rubric here for our placement test. And when we look at grammar, one of the problems that we found is that when we have these general statements like few errors with no patterns or failure, we had problems with these adverbs like constant errors. What's constant? And we also wanted to tell the rater what's an error, like an error in simple past, an error in verb tenses, so that we know what's a 1, what's a 2, what's a 3, what's a 4, and what's a 5. So the person would have an idea what kind of error we're talking about, so anybody would have would be able to picture this person speaking, a speech of a discourse of this person,
Yes, and you make a good point too about sometimes
it's hard.
Yeah, right. And sometimes distinguishing between, between a 4 and a 5, etc. But I guess everybody, just a reminder, and Sherry, I mean, just making a point about that particular context, but sometimes overlooking the mistakes. But I mean, generally speaking, when you're assessing speaking, you're primarily assessing two things. One is fluency, and the other is accuracy. Right? And fluency is often, it's often related to the rate of speech. How fast are they producing the language, right? Like I'm doing now as a native speaker of English. And, sometimes people with lower levels of proficiency, it takes them a lot longer. They're a lot less fluent. But the other thing is accuracy. I mean, what is just the number of errors and mistakes that they're making in both grammar and also with vocabulary. And it's also it's almost one of the defining features of distinguishing between proficiency. And if you talk to someone who's proficient in a language, whatever language it is, they're making few or no mistakes at all, right? And then as the proficiency gets lower, the number of errors and mistakes gets higher. Right? If you interview me in Spanish or whatever, and I mean, you'll see that I can barely produce a sentence without any kind of mistake or going on there, right? So just a reminder, those two things about fluency and particularly accuracy. So sometimes if we diminish or don't pay attention to accuracy, then I think it creates major problems in us when we're looking to scoring or evaluating people's proficiency.
Eddie?
I'm not saying that we're just going to ignore them completely, you know.
No,
okay?
no.
But,
yeah, Sherry, I'm not just picking on you in particular, and you're talking about a specific type of test
no,
too.
that's okay.
Also, that's that specific type of test.
Yeah.
I remember doing teacher training in Colombia, and I was down there, and it was a medical class, and it was something very similar. The test was about offering a diagnosis and analysis. These were nurses, right? And so they were, as with your context, they were overlooking some of the grammatical and the mistake things, but and focusing on their ability to get the idea and the meaning across. Somebody, Perry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just have a question. Where does intonation enter into the picture?
Good question. Somebody was asking about that earlier also. And intonation, I mean, I guess it's kind of a little bit related to fluency, but I guess does it get into this? It's the idea of accent and pronunciation, and but somebody was asking about pronunciation also, and at least in my experience, I find that assessing pronunciation, and particularly with the students I've dealt with, mostly it's either, usually the pronunciation was good enough to be comprehensible, and that's all I was looking for, that it was good enough, it was understandable. And I remember a few rare cases where people had just very strong accents, and it was kind of hard to understand what it was that they were saying. But I think generally, if people are comprehensible and their accent is good, Perry, sometimes you get, with a lack of intonation, you get these machine-like responses, these flat kind of level responses, and that's but if you can still understand what they're saying, I guess I guess I'm inclined to cut people some slack about the intonation. Maybe I do J1 interviews just for visiting scholars who are coming into the country, and not too long ago I interviewed somebody from France, and his English was great, but he was, to be honest, he was kind of a boring guy with a boring kind of personality and just this very flat intonation, but I was like, yeah, I was having a bit of a difficult time communicating with him. But his score at the end, I gave him like one of the highest scores, but so I didn't fault him too much for it. Yeah. Okay.
I would like to add something.
Please go ahead.
Yeah. In my case, like I focus on fluency more than on accuracy,
right,
especially when you use task-based language teaching.
Okay.
For example, I focus on the outcome. For example, if I'm teaching the students the sales skills and they need to convince the customers to buy the product,
yep,
if they are successful in doing that and conveying the message to the customer, then I don't want to use the word ignore, but I focus more on fluency rather than on accuracy, and I focus on the level of outcome achieved by the students.
Okay, I guess that's fine, but you would have to, whatever the test purpose was, you would have to take that into account, because there's a potential problem there also in just the validity of the test. And the validity, I mean, it's like, for validity, you're identifying specifically what it is that you're trying to assess. The other thing is that if students are doing a large-scale test, a mainstream test, whether it's TOEFL or ITEP or whatever it is, they are certainly going to be assessed on accuracy, and then the mistakes and their errors that they're making. That is something that they'll,
like IELTS.
Yeah, they'll certainly be assessed on. Perry, if I can just throw a question to you, I mean, when of course you work with the ITEP test, I mean, accuracy of language production, I guess that has an important impact on the scoring for your test.
Sure, yes, it does.
Yeah. So
Eddie, could I ask you a question here?
Please.
When you are, I mean, this that we're looking at, we're talking about as us individuals doing it. When you're teaching someone how to do the evaluation, do you have them listen to individuals who are producing at varying levels and then try to identify that within the rubric, or do you ask a native speaker to say mistakes in the languages?
No, I mean,
how do you teach this?
Yeah, usually we would do that with, so for example, when working at the English Center, we instituted a speaking test for our placement test. So all new students coming in, everybody got interviewed. So we were interviewing, just 5-minute interviews, we're interviewing everybody and giving them a score. So then we had to do rater training, and we had to do calibration, so we're all kind of, you know, on the same page rater wise. So I interviewed some students, and I said, hey, can you help us? Where I just want to do an interview, and I interviewed people that were of a lower level of proficiency, and then we had some you know, students working in our lab that were at a higher level of proficiency, sometimes very high, and we would play those during our training sessions, right? And the teachers, they didn't know what they were going to be hearing, whether it's basic, intermediate, or high level of proficiency, and they had to just do the scoring. And one of the things I reminded them of was listen for the errors, right? The more mistakes, the more errors you hear, the lower score you should be giving, and that kind of helped. But you, Patty, I think it's essential. You need that. And I think anybody, especially anybody who's doing any kind of rater training like that, and you know, that's necessary.
Okay.
Tani?
Patty, I just wanted to mention something, because I've been reading about this because I think it's really interesting, and how non-native speakers, what the non-native speaker teachers or raters listen for as opposed to native speakers.
Yeah.
What they're listening for. So usually, so what I've seen in the research is that native speaker teachers or raters are listening more for whether they understand it or for the message, as opposed to the actual accuracy of the language. And non-native speaker teachers are listening more for the accuracy of the language. And I'm thinking about myself here. Like I'm listening for the errors that they're making. Intonation for me is just something that I only realize that the intonation is wrong when there's something obviously wrong with the intonation. It's something that I don't pay attention much to. And so I've seen in the research those differences. And I think it's important for both non-native speakers and native speakers to be paying attention to the aspects that are really important in speaking production.
Yep, very good. And it's a good point also, because we all bring our biases to assessments that we're using also. And you know, I remember I was teaching in Japan I taught in Japan for a long time, and I remember telling students that the next time I saw nice in an essay, I was going to immediately fail that student. So, I mean, but we bring some biases into play also, and so I mean, if you have multiple people that are involved in scoring or rating, then you need to do kind of rater training. And I remember telling teachers, so we'd have a training session, and one teacher is giving a 5 out of 5, and the other teacher is giving like a 2.5 or 3. And so what's going on? And then the teacher is saying, well, I'm thinking about the level and how, if they're going to go into that class, and I'm also thinking about they're also from this country and etc. And I'm reminding them, you have to forget all of that. The only thing you're assessing is what is it they're producing. It's the same with in some ways it's easier to do with writing, right? You have an essay there in front of you and you have a rubric. You forget level and what country they're from and all of it. All you're looking at is what is it they've written here. And it's the same with, we try to do the same thing with language production also, and try to, you know, ignore some things that might impact and bias our scoring. Yeah. Everybody, I've gone out of screen share mode, and I've kind of mentioned some of the things that I wanted to say. Just a reminder that rubrics, of course, are a big issue, and that's why rubrics going to have their own particular webinar, and we're doing that in September. So there's a lot more to be said about it. But just you know, in the time we have left, what other challenges or issues or problems do you have in your context with assessing speaking? Any other things we can discuss together?
I have a question about what everybody thinks about recording versus not recording performance. I mean,
Great.
for me as a interlocutor, as a rater, I have to record. I just feel very unsure of myself. So I can't in every situation, but, and then talking about the effective problems, I guess, with that for the student. I would just wonder how everyone handles that, what the research, I haven't read enough about it, but for me, I really need to record.
Susan, and we'll let everybody respond there. Can you tell us, so you're talking about a classroom assessment. You're talking about you're teaching a class, a speaking class, and recording students in that context, yes?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
okay.
Yeah.
Anybody, what experience you have about recording or not recording tests?
Definitely recording, actually video recording if you can, because I think that gives you a fuller appreciation of the expression and the ability of the individual to produce. But you second guess yourself if you only listen to it once. I'm sure you listen to it multiple times before you assign a rubric or assign a decision. To me, it's absolutely essential that you have that ability to hear it, because you're second guessing yourself. Or the other part of it is if there are more than one person who's evaluating, which happens in other kinds of tests, you need to make sure that the whoever has the deciding factor is in agreement. I mean, when you were talking about a 2.5 and a 5, that happens a lot of times among people who are new to doing the evaluation. And I think you really need to have that so that you can discuss what it is that you each see or hear as being different.
Patty, just a quick question. If you're talking about video recordings now, do you need to get permission from the test taker for that? Do you need to get individual permission?
Yeah. Well, if they're in your class or if they've signed up to take a test, that's their permission.
And is that potentially problematic? So, for example, if I'm in your class and it's like, I don't want to be video recorded.
Well, let's say you're a Saudi woman and you don't want to have a video of your face. Certainly, that would be something that could be dealt with. It could be blank. Just as Arouge is doing.
What about I was just being a difficult Canadian man and didn't want to be recorded?
I'd say tough shit.
Good point. Okay. Please, what about recording or not recording? Yeah.
Well, I go for recording because I think that recording would help the learners or the test takers themselves actually to have this kind of self-assessment. So they can reflect back on their performances and they can find their mistakes themselves and correct themselves also. Maybe you can listen to the recordings together and start analyzing these recordings. So I find it very, very
Sherry,
helpful.
you make the recordings available to the students?
Yeah. Yes. Many times actually we record it on the cloud. Yep. And they have the link to these recordings, so they can even get back to them if they missed a class or something. Yep. So it's very, very helpful for the learners and the teacher, especially in test preparation courses.
Right. Okay. Anybody else? Recordings?
Yeah, I have to say that that's one positive of our new online world is that previously I was in the classroom doing these discussion groups and I would try to record the audio on my phone and not screw that up and then try to be taking my notes and listen and pay attention. And now I'm on Zoom and it's automatically recorded by the university, and so the recordings are always there for me to look at afterward. And I found that really helpful for me because there's the learner affect, but there's me as the rater as well. Stuff might be happening in my environment and I miss something. Or just things in the flow of the discussion where I've missed something in my notes and I want to go back and check. So I don't always watch the recordings, but it's been really helpful for something that, and I got it wrong, where I thought, oh, okay, I remember he was very unsure of himself and I'm mixing up my students or something.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. Susan, I just remember that. I mean, I did, I was an IELTS examiner, that test for a couple of years, and all the exams are recorded. But what I realized later, the recording was for the purpose of not listening to the test taker, the recordings were listening to me. And I remember at one point I got a message from a supervisor at IELTS saying, Eddie, your interview was 93 seconds too long and you need to reduce the time, etc. But I realized the recordings, they're recording the interviewer, the interlocutor, not necessarily the students. If there are any challenges or something, they can go back. But for them, the primary reason for the recording was for training purposes and to make sure it's a very standardized test. So to make sure people are following it. Susan, in my case, I've never used recordings. I've never recorded presentations or anything. Primarily, the big issue was just practicality in terms of time to go back and listen to it and stuff. But I found that if I set up the exam well enough and I had my rubric and the times and stuff, that I didn't need to record it. It was just unnecessary. I could do the assessments and the things that I wanted to do, you know, while the test was going on, and I didn't record anything. And I guess I got comfortable and was comfortable with the tests and was maybe I was pretty confident in the scores I was giving, and I thought they were fair and good. So, I mean, some teachers will do it, and some for very good reasons. And people are very conscientious, and they want to make sure that their scores are valid and accurate and stuff. But the big issue often is, and I'm sure you know, is just the time consumption and the practicality of it.
Well, I think too, it was discussed in this article, is how you're feeling that day. You know, I mean, if I'm not doing too well one day, and then sorry students, but then I can listen to it the next day and like, oh, okay, I had a little bit wrong. I mean, I'd say 75% of the time my first impressions are correct, but that's 15% or 25%, whatever. Incorrect. So
yeah, I mean, you can record it and record. I think if you're comfortable doing it, and for some people say, well, it helps me make better decisions, then that's great and good. But I think on the other side is that you can do speaking tests and assess people's speaking ability without recording. It's not necessary. It can be optional and good for people, but I don't think it's certainly not necessary.
I guess one of the questions, I'm sorry to just ask one more, is
go ahead.
If any of you think that it affects to my mind, it was Zoom, as I think Holly was saying, it's a much easier and less stressful thing to record a student, whereas in class you set up your camera and I mean, I almost think this has helped in that regard. So, but I haven't had any complaints about being recorded so far, my students being recorded. I didn't know if anyone else is running into issues with that.
Yep. That's a good point. One other thing to mention is that sometimes if you're recording something, then you could say that, I mean, you're assessing a recording of a performance, right? And not necessarily that you're directly assessing somebody. Yeah.
Eddie,
Tani, please.
I just wanted to make a point, because maybe not so much now that we're all online and it's becoming way more normal, but I think before I would always think about how recording would make the student more self-conscious too.
Yeah.
Maybe not so much anymore because everybody's used to like making videos of themselves and like being recorded everywhere. But I think before I never recorded because I always thought it would be more artificial in a way, or I would make them more self-conscious. Oh, I'm being recorded, I have to record, so even more anxious about the activity itself.
Yeah.
But maybe definitely not so much anymore, I would think.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. But Tani, maybe also that recording part maybe becomes a bit less important. But maybe the other more important thing is that people are very conscious now. Is that, well, what are you doing with that recording? Where's it going? Who's listening to it? Who's hearing it? And people are careful now about what information they're revealing, and so what happens when somebody says, if you're the difficult Canadian type and say, I don't want to be recorded, so.
Well, the other thing
maybe it's kind of
the documentation. If you have a recording and you're talking with a student, a lot of times a student may not realize what errors they're making. We said teaching methodology, but when you can actually go back and point out some of those things, we've all had the difficult student who came in and said, I need a higher score, I should have a higher score, I'm better than this. And when you can go back and you can you can't document what is just a spoken conversation, but you can document what's a taped one. And I think that has some bearing on, especially in society today.
Yeah, very good point, Patty. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I have to mention something that it was very terrifying for me as a teacher at the beginning, actually, to start recording and to be careful with every word I say in the class and not to use the, language one in class. But it depends on the level. Sometimes students actually resort to speak in Arabic in some situations. Right. So I had to say that we're recording. So I was terrified actually that someone might listen to this and take it against me. But and from one session to another session, I found out that students themselves actually got to, they got used to the routine of the class now, and they started to ask, now we are recording, right? So we have to start using a language 2. It's not language 1. So they started to have this kind of class routine and the class culture. So they started to have the momentum of the class. Very and other students actually, when it came to the test preparation courses, they were keen actually to ask for the recordings, because they knew that the recordings would help them to spot their mistakes, to be aware of the rubrics, and to take care of the tasks, how to handle different tasks, from the integrated to the independent, how to be persuasive about the intonation thing. So now they became like experts.
That's great. I mean, Sherry, it's a good example of actually the positive washback of the recordings that we're having on the classes, and even on the students' language production. Very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, everybody, we're pretty much come to the end of our webinar. So before I go, Perry has a point to make.
Yep. Yes, I know. But I want to encourage each and every one of you to send us a blog to LTS, to English Language Testing Society website, so we can put it up on our website. So that's your assignment for this week.
Okay. That's homework. That's great. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for joining, and you have some very interesting perspectives and experiences, and it's great listening and talking to people from everywhere and learning from you as well. So I hope you'll come back and join us next time. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.